own startup company. We do micro-licensing on the web. The question I'm about to ask you, I Googled it and I couldn't find an answer. And so I'm looking to know, is there such a thing for a pattern for a talented person? And is it something that I can recognize and something I can learn? How do you hire people? How do you know that he's talent?
How do you know, so what kind of person?
Is it something that can be learned? Talented person.
Yeah.
How do you recognize them and how do you hire them?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think, and I'll call on Joel on software. Because interestingly, when you're starting out as an entrepreneur and when Google was really small, one of the things that happens is you're like hiring the first lawyer and you're hiring the first PR person, you're hiring the first person who's going to do mergers and acquisitions. So one of the things that happens is people ask you to interview people who don't have any of the same skills as you and they don't do anything that you do. So people, like for example, like we would all be asked to do this. They had this interesting interview training, but it had to be this very general interview training. Where it could work for any function. So they pulled all of Google together and they said, okay, here's how we're going to do interviewing. But of course we couldn't go through coding questions because it wasn't just about engineers. We couldn't go through just PR questions because it wasn't PR. And they said, like, what should you look for? You should look for two things. Smart gets things done. And you should have a very good vibe on both of those. Right? So you want smart people because if you have smart people who can't get things done, that's a problem. And if you have people who get things done but aren't very smart, they do the wrong things. So you really need to have both of those. And it is true. I mean, like if you a lot of times you're sitting there in an interview and you're like, well, look, we're having an interesting conversation, but I'm just not getting the vibe that this person really executes and works really hard. Like a lot of times if you get into a quandary in an interview and you're wondering sort of what to think, one of the things to think about is someone who's smart and gets things done, because that's something that works across almost all kinds of people. The other piece that came from one of my bosses along the way, was Jose, one of our SVPs of engineering, and he basically said, doing an interview is a job, and what we're doing is we're sending you into that room to have an opinion, and to come out with an opinion. We've always had a grading scale at Google based almost on debate positions. I designed the scale way back in the day and I was a high school debater. But basically it goes from 1 to 4. 1 means I don't want to hire this person, I'm willing to argue why not. So you take a role of are you an arguer or are you the person who's going to be convinced? 2 is I don't want to hire this person and but I could be convinced. 3 is I want to hire them but I could be convinced otherwise. And 4 is I want to hire them and I'm willing to argue why. And you can also have sort of a decimal system. So, you can be like a 3.6, which means you're positive and not all the way to 4. But one of the things that happened was people kept going into interviews and coming out and rating their people 2.5. And this just totally enraged Urs. And Urs was like, look, if you come out of an interview and you give someone a 2.5, which basically means you don't know if we should hire them or not, it means you didn't do your job in the interview. Right, so I do think that one of the things, it's your job to form an opinion and decide, is this person going to be a good addition to the team or not? So I think it's hard to talk about broadly all kinds of hiring in a company, but I would say look for people who are smart and get things done, and make sure that when you walk out of an interview, you have an opinion. And I think I can take one more question.